everybody.
Good morning.
Grace and peace be with you this morning. So I wanted to do something a little different since it's Mother's Day. That's why we heard some different readings, and you're going to hear a different kind of sermon this morning. Usually we follow the lectionary, which means that there are 2 or 3 readings that we all hear that are assigned each week, and then the pastor preaches on one of those texts. And more often than not, it's whatever's in the gospel. And that's good. The lectionary has its uses. It's a helpful tool. But sometimes, like today, I think it's good to look at a different story. And so I chose this passage telling the story of Hannah because it connects with Mother's Day. Because Mother's Day is a complicated day. There's some tension in this day. Because on the one hand, it is a day of joy. Because we celebrate the mothers in our lives. The women who gave life to us, who raised us, who shaped us into who we are. And mothers, too, they can use this day to celebrate the joys and blessings of having children. But on the other hand, it also can be a difficult day. Because there are women who long to be mothers, but they have struggled to have children. This is a hard day for them. And there are other people who don't have children but feel pressured to, even though that's maybe not what they're called to do. And there are also families, some of them, you may have heard of them, that are not perfect. Some of our relationships with our parents and our children's, they can be tense, they can be distant. So those kind of things can be brought up on a day like today also. And then there are those of you who have lost parents or who have lost children. And that pain and grief can be amplified on a day like today. So Mother's Day is complicated. That's why I wanted to tell the story of Hannah, because that too is a beautiful story. It's a story about a mother and her child, but it's a little more complicated than that. If you remember at the beginning of this passage, Hannah goes into the temple, and she goes there with her husband and her husband's other wife and her husband's other wife's children. And we are thinking, what could possibly go wrong in this scenario, right? And the text, it tells us that the other wife, Peninnah, is Hannah's rival. And why is that? Because their loving husband, Elkanah, has made no attempt to hide that he loves Hannah more. He gives her a double portion. So Hannah, who's probably the newer marriage, probably the younger wife, Elkanah favors her over Peninnah, the wife who has given him children. And what does he care if Hannah doesn't have children of her own? Because he's got one wife to give him kids and one wife to make him happy. What a great guy, right? And you can tell a lot about what kind of person Elkanah is by how he talks to Hannah. He says, Hannah, why are you sad? I notice you've been crying a lot. You haven't been eating as much. Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Now, for the record, if you're ever trying to console your spouse, never use that line. Am I not more to you than 10 sons? He doesn't say, as he maybe could have, Hannah, I notice that you're sad, and I just want you to know I will always love you no matter what, and you are worth more to me than anything. No, he says, I am a catch. Any woman would be lucky to have me. I don't get why you would be sad since I'm in your life. What a great guy. And then there's Eli. So Hannah goes into the temple. She starts praying silently. Her lips are moving. And the priest, Eli, sees a woman praying and thinks she must be drunk. And so he tries to kick her out. And I love what Hannah tells him. She says, no, I'm not drunk. I've been sitting here pouring out my soul before the Lord. So do not regard me as a worthless woman. Do not regard me as a worthless woman. Let's pause and think of how many ways throughout history and how many ways still today women are treated like they are worth less than men. That is a reality still today in 2017. And so Hannah encounters that and she says, no, that is not okay. Because I have real legitimate concerns. God cares for me. God cares for women's issues as much as God cares for men. And then notice what the priest does. What he reacts when this strong-willed woman stands up for herself. He says, okay, go in peace. May God grant you whatever you were praying for. He doesn't even ask what she was praying for. He doesn't want to hear about her problems. He just wants out of the conversation. Another great guy in Hannah's life. Are you starting to get a sense of what she had to deal with all the time? So it's within this context that Hannah makes her vow, her desperate plea to God. God, if you just give me a son, I swear that I will give him to serve you, that I will let someone else, the priest, raise him instead of me. And so Samuel is born, and Samuel grows up in this complicated, messy situation. So what I want to do this morning is to imagine how Samuel might have felt on a day like Mother's Day. Yes, Mother's Day only started in the 1900s, but imagine if they did it thousands of years ago, what Samuel might have written as an adult to his mother Hannah for Mother's Day. I think he might have said something like this. Dear Hannah, I want to be honest. Mother's Day is always bittersweet for me. It was hard to be raised by priests, knowing that I had a family. I had parents and brothers and sisters, but they gave me up. You gave me up. It used to make me so mad when Eli would tell me, "Be grateful for your mother, Samuel. You wouldn't be here without her." Because I didn't feel grateful. I felt abandoned. And it was all because of that vow, that deal you made with God. O Lord, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. Give me a son, and I'll give him up to be raised by someone else. What kind of a parent makes that deal? And what kind of a God makes that deal? Even now that I'm an adult, it still sounds twisted. God only lets you have children after you promise to give God your first child. Does that mean I was just a bargaining chip? An acceptable sacrifice for you to have a real family? Because you chose to sacrifice me, I never felt like I was really part of a family. And so I'll always have bitter feelings about that vow, that decision you made for my life. But Hannah, I want you to know that I'm also grateful. Even though I grew up in the priest's house, in the house of the Lord, the priests weren't the ones who taught me about God. It's true, they taught me all about religion. I learned all about worship. I learned how to pray and to make sacrifices. I learned how to respect those animals that we killed. I learned the religious traditions that have been passed on through generations. And I heard those stories of Israel, especially the story of God leading our people out of slavery in Egypt. We talked about how God used to actually speak to Moses. And even though our ancestors made some mistakes, God was guiding them. God was taking them somewhere. But according to Eli and the other priests, nobody had heard God speaking for a long time. We never talked about it, but a lot of people wondered if these stories were just fairy tales. But the priests, they didn't know what to do, so they just kept doing what they had been taught. We prayed, we sacrificed, we followed the rules because that's what we've always done. Even though the religion we practiced was supposed to connect us with God, no one was actually listening for God anymore. So the priests taught me about religion, but it was my mother who taught me about God. After you brought me to the temple, every year you came to see me. You brought the clothes that you had made for me that year, and before long you were always crying and laughing and beaming with joy. But what stuck with me between the visits was the song you would sing. The song of prayer that you would tell me later you had been singing ever since I was first born. And even at a young age, I could remember the words because of the music. Your song talked about a God who is still speaking to those of us who will listen. Your song praised the God of justice, a God who turns corrupt and abusive systems upside down. Your song showed me a God that sees everything that's wrong with this world and refuses to let it be. A God who breaks the weapons of the warriors, gives strength instead to the weak. A God who raises up the poor from dust and ashes and puts them in places of honor. The God of your song hears when people cry out and responds. As I got older, that song you taught me, it made me see things differently. I saw people around me who were hungry, that stayed hungry, and I knew that that's not what God wants. And instead of the poor being lifted up, I watched as the priests around me took advantage of the poor by demanding more sacrifices from people who couldn't say no, and then keeping them for themselves. And I saw the women around me, like you, being treated as less valuable than men, being ignored or being used by men for their own interests. And none of these things fit with the justice and the goodness in your song. Years ago, during one of your visits, I asked you how you could keep believing in a just God when we live in such an unjust world. And I'll never forget what you told me. Samuel, every time I think about you, I remember that once upon a time I cried out and God listened. That's why I named you Samuel. Your name means God listens. Just imagine what might happen in this world if we were listening too. Now that I'm a prophet, people ask me about the first time that I started to hear God's voice. It seems like now everyone knows that story. I heard my name in the middle of the night. I kept going back and forth to the priest, thinking it was his voice, until I stopped and listened to what else the voice had to say. And it was God. God told me that things were going to change, that God was going to use me to help turn around this corrupt religious system and bring hope to those who have felt lost and forgotten for so long. But when I tell people this story, they often ask me how I knew it was the voice of God and not just some other voice in my head. I knew it was God's voice because I'd heard it before in my mother's song, because you taught me how to listen. I can't thank you enough for that gift. Love, Samuel. My hope for us today is that like Samuel and Hannah, we too can learn to listen, to hear how God is calling us to be part of a better world, even though our lives can get complicated and messy. Days like Mother's Day, they remind us that family and relationships, they fill us with joy, and they can also bring us heartache. But that doesn't mean God isn't listening to you. That doesn't mean God has forgotten about you or has abandoned you. And maybe you have heard that question, or maybe you've asked it yourself lately. How can we keep believing in a good and a just God with all the things around us that are not good? God is listening when we cry out. And all along, God has told us how to bring about justice. Take care of the needy and the weak. Lift up the poor. Remember that from the beginning, every person was created in the image of God, like we heard the choir singing. Every person. Every man, woman, young, old, black, white, brown, Christian, atheist, Muslim, Buddhist, gay, straight, every single person is valued by God. And so they should all be equally valued by us. That is the faith that Hannah passed down through her song of prayer. And it's the same faith that years later Mary, the mother of Jesus, would pass down with her song of prayer, which we're about to sing together. May we listen to God and receive that same faith so we too can pass it on. Because God is listening. Just imagine what this world might look like if we all started listening too. Amen.